Konbanwa minasan. Welcome to the Japan America Society presentation, Isamu Noguchi, Transnational Icon in Detroit. I am Lizanne Guang, President of the Japan America Society of Michigan and Southwest Ontario. This 1 hour long program is part of our ongoing series on Japanese art and design in Detroit. Last year, this series explored the lasting influence of the legendary Japanese American architect Minoru Yamasaki on the Detroit cityscape and how it influenced Shinola, the Detroit watchmaker, to create a Yamazaki themed wristwatch. That video can still be seen on our YouTube channel. The link to that channel, as well as links to the Society's website and social media accounts, are posted in the chat area of this page. The Society welcomes new members, and it's easy to join on our website. We continuously post Japan-related programming notices on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, so please follow us for more programs like this one. Two more local custodians of Japanese traditions are co-sponsoring tonight's program. We're so pleased to have all of you with us who heard about this program from the Freer House and from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. The Freer House was one of the first sites to welcome citizens of Japan to Detroit over 130 years ago. The house promotes awareness of other instances of connections to Japan in Metro Detroit, such as the collection of Yamasaki buildings on Wayne State's campus and Noguchi's designs for Hart Plaza on our downtown waterfront. And from the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, I'd like to introduce Greg Whitkop, its director, to say a few words about a major Japanese project going on there now. Greg.
Hello, Lizanne, thank you very much. It is an honor to be able to partner with the Japan America Society on this presentation tonight about Isamu Noguchi. In addition to the shared history that Cranbrook and Noguchi have with the Herman Miller Company in Michigan, it is perhaps even more important connection to Japanese culture is through the Cranbrook Japanese Garden. Created by our founders, George and Ellen Booth, the publishers of the Detroit News, the garden began to take form over 100 years ago in 1915. Today, we are working to rejuvenate the garden with the designer Sadafumi Uchiyama, the chief curator of the Portland Japanese Garden in Oregon. If you have not yet visited the garden, I invite you to spend some time at Cranbrook and perhaps even join us in the adventure as we complete the work that our founders started in 1915. Thank you very much for allowing us to join you tonight.
Thank you, Greg. It's our pleasure. It's our great pleasure. Now, just before we begin the presentation, this talk is sponsored by the Japan-US Friendship Commission via an ongoing effort of the National Association of Japan America Societies, headquartered in Washington, D.C. The president of the National Association, Peter Kelly, is online with us, and he would like to greet everyone. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Lizanne. This is Peter Kelly from the National Association of Japan America Societies. We're delighted to thank you all for joining this program tonight. There are 38 Japan America Societies all over North America, and each one of them is locally managed and locally funded. Their purpose is to strengthen the relationship between Japanese and Americans at the local level. The National Association of Japan America Societies, where I work, provides Japan-related programs to our members. And tonight's is one of them. We offer series on public affairs, geostrategy, 2 business speaker series, a security series, and a cultural program. Tonight's is the cultural program. We started it in 2015 with the aim of demonstrating the impact that art has had on the US-Japan relationship. And the way we wanted to do that was to focus on collections of Japanese art in American museums. which began in the late 19th century and has continued all the way through to now. We do so by asking the curators of those collections to speak about the art, why it is where it is, and the impact it has on the US-Japan relationship. Tonight's program features not a collection of art, but an entire museum, the Noguchi Museum in Long Island City, New York. And we're delighted to have that happening here in Detroit because of the deep connection that Noguchi has with the city of Detroit. This year, there are 8 programs in the series taking place. The other curators, in addition to Dakin Hart, who are participating, are Frank Feltons of the Fair Gallery in Washington, D.C., Rhiannon Paget of the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, Florida, and Sarah Thompson of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And programs have taken place not only in Detroit, but also in Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Dallas, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and Denver. We think that this series overall draws attention to the importance of art in the US-Japan relationship. It is named after Dick Wood, who was NAJA's vice chair, but he also has a Detroit connection. He was a native Detroiter and a graduate of the Cranbrook School. We are very grateful to the curators for participating in this program. Without the curators, we wouldn't have the program. So we thank Dakin Hart and the other curators for participating. Also, our funder, the Japan-United States Friendship Commission out of Washington, D.C., which has a special interest in the promotion of the cultural relationship. And finally, the Japan-America Society of Michigan and Southwest Ontario, and the 2 co-hosts, the Cranbrook Center and the Freer House. Lizanne?
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you for all of your support. Very appreciated. We're excited about tonight's program. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dakin Hart. Since 2013, Dakin has been the senior curator for the Isamu Noguchi Foundation and Garden Museum in Long Island City in New York. He oversees the museum's exhibitions, collections, catalogue raisonné, archives, and public programming of the single most influential Japanese-American artist of the 20th century. His stewardship ensures that Noguchi's work is accessible to inspire the present generation and future generations. Dakin, there's been so much anticipation for your talk here. We have a record audience online with us, and we're very grateful to have you with us. Welcome, Dakin.
Hey, Zam, thank you so much. And thank you also, Peter and Greg. It is a great pleasure to be here and to be with you. So our subject tonight is Isamu Noguchi as a transnational icon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how he became one. That's certainly something, well, in one sense, he did set out to be that. But in other ways, it was just accidents of birth, serendipities, and then, of course, his own choices. But this is what has made Noguchi of such enduring interest, because our planet, more than anything, really needs people who knit it together. And Noguchi, more than anything else, is someone who did that. As you can see in this title slide image, combining Noguchi with the big blue marble image, the famous big blue marble image. And this is something that will make more sense, I think, as we progress. But we're going to start a little bit at the beginning, because without understanding Noguchi's personal biography, it's pretty hard to understand how he ended up being the kind of artist that he was. So Noguchi was the product of an Irish-American mother from Brooklyn, Bryn Mawr educated, spent a year abroad in Paris, wanted to be a writer, was living in New York City. She answered an ad in the paper for someone to help a Japanese poet publish in English. Noguchi's father, Yoshihiro Noguchi, is at that point, a bohemian, wandering, itinerant, but already fairly well-known Japanese poet who came to the West Coast of the United States, spent quite a lot of time actually there, wrote a book about Yosemite, a book-length poem about Yosemite, lived with Joaquin Miller, knew John Muir, got involved in the sort of early ecological movement there, and then took the train east and ended up in New York, where he placed this ad. He's the first Japanese writer to publish in English in the United States. He wrote about Hiroshige and Hokusai and introduced many important artists to the West. American audiences in particular in English, the all important detail there. And also is credited with by people like Ezra Pound of introducing haiku into English, which, as many of you probably know, is incredibly important in the Imagist revolution in American poetry in particular, in the early part of the 20th century. So two sort of extraordinary people who come together and produce Noguchi. Now, Noguchi was actually born in Los Angeles, California, out in a field, essentially in a shed. His mother was quite impoverished. She had gone out to get family support. By this point, Yonejiro had already gone back to Japan, and Noguchi grew up in a pretty complicated situation. Some of you probably have read the biography. There's several biographies now, but the most recent is by Hayden Herrera. It's excellent, a single volume biography where you learn things like the fact that Noguchi was not named for the first 2 years of his life. He just went by Boy or Yo for short for a couple of years because Leonie Gilmore, his mother, I don't think I named her before, I'm sorry. Leonie Gilmore wanted his father to name him. And so she waited. She eventually decided to leave California and go to Japan to follow his father. By the time they got there, this image is Noguchi in Japan on the far right. By the time they got there, Noguchi's father had started a Japanese family. So things were not simple, but Leonie decided to stay anyway. She taught English, mostly to expatriates, the children of expatriates. And they lived and tried to have a fairly normal family life in a little village not too far from Yokohama called Chigasaki on the coast. They built a home there. Noguchi helped to build a house. This is one of his kind of seminal experiences that he looked back to later in life. You can see him here. He's on the left. We're seeing him in many different guises. And the sense that you should get here is a kind of fluidity and shifting of identity as he tries to figure out who he is and where he fits in. One very important thing in this passport image on the far right now to know about him, and you can't tell in many of these photos because most of these photos are in black and white from early on, is that Noguchi had piercing blue eyes. So even though at times he looked quite Japanese, he could never pass for Japanese in Japan. And paradoxically, the first place that Noguchi experienced racism, and he did experience racism throughout his life, was in Japan as a half-white boy. And that is part of why his mother decided to send him back to the United States for high school. And that's why they applied for this passport photo. And he, in fact, made his way back to the United States alone, 3 weeks across the Pacific, and then a couple of weeks on the train to rural Indiana. She had seen an ad in Scientific American for a hands-on learn by doing school in Rolling Prairie, Indiana, which is a teeny little village in rural Indiana. And he went there only to find the school had closed because of the outbreak of World War I, or our entry into World War I, and it had become a camp. So Noguchi found himself in LaPorte, Indiana, the nearest large town, and went all the way through high school, lived with a Swedenborgian minister, and had the kind of patronage of the founders of the school who would become an important influence on him. His name was Edward Rumley, whose family had not invented, but popularized the oil pull tractor and made quite a lot of money and wanted to be a major Midwestern industrialist. This image on the right, Rumley got Noguchi a job as a kind of a nanny, babysitter, tutor, and assistant to himself for his children. Gutzon Borglum is, of course, the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. It was not a good experience for Noguchi. Borglum told Noguchi that he would never make a sculptor. Borglum, as many of you probably know, was a virulent racist, and one can only imagine what he thought when Noguchi showed up at his door. Here Noguchi is at the age of 20, making a perfect copy of Borglum's seated Lincoln for a crowd. We don't know exactly how long it took, but it was probably over the course of a couple of hours, but he did this for a public audience. So he went to, after Rolling Prairie and then LaPorte, he moved to New York City, enrolled at Columbia in pre-med, wanted to follow his not namesake and not actual close relative, but a very famous Noguchi in New York City at the time, Hideo Noguchi, who was the discoverer of the smallpox virus, and was at a local university as a professor of medicine. And Noguchi decided he wanted to follow him into medicine. But after less than a year, his mother, by this point, had moved back to the United States, moved to New York with his half-sister to be with him or near him. And she really pushed him out of Columbia and out of med school. She felt he was, as she put it, destined for greater things, by which she meant not being a doctor, but being an artist. So she encouraged him to go to art classes at the Leonardo da Vinci School of Art in the West Village with an Italian immigrant named Onora Ruotolo, who taught Noguchi to sculpt and realized very, very quickly that Noguchi was a prodigy. As you can see, Noguchi produced this seated Lincoln just a few months into his career as a sculptor. And by career, it means he had not been sculpting before, and 3 months in, he was able to do this. So he very quickly took off as a sculptor and as a really academic sculptor, making, as you can see, fairly classical sculpture, only to realize a little ways into it, he was by this time already a member of the National Academy of Sculptors and had become kind of the poster boy for academic sculpture, which upon for the first time visiting a Brancusi exhibition in New York City at the Bremer Gallery in 1926, which he walked through with the curator of that show, Marcel Duchamp, he realized that he had become the kind of standard bearer of a totally passé art form. And he didn't want that. And he decided to start over. And he applied for a Guggenheim grant, which at that time you wrote to the family to get, and he got it. And he went to Paris. And he was at a cafe with another American, James McAlpin, who said that he knew Brancusi and offered to introduce him. This is how Noguchi's entire life went. He took him to see Brancusi. Brancusi didn't speak any English. Noguchi didn't speak any French or Romanian for that matter. But Noguchi somehow managed to talk his way into the studio of an artist who never had assistants and never took on students. But Noguchi ended up spending 6 months with Brancusi, and that kind of set him on the path. Very important to understand at this point, and actually in his Guggenheim application, Noguchi said that he wanted, like his father, to bridge the East and the West, and that he saw himself as a kind of bridging figure. It's incredibly important that from the very beginning, Noguchi realized that what would set him apart, or what would be a kind of an indissoluble part of his character, was his own hybridity. The fact that he was biracial and was choosing to be multicultural at a time when that was extraordinarily fraught and quite unusual. Noguchi, almost most of his life really, was often the only biracial person in the circles that he was traveling in. But when it came to choosing his mentors, it's extremely instructive because Noguchi is often stereotyped as bridging Japan and the United States, with Japan and the United States kind of standing in for the East and the West, as if they represent all of the East and all of the West. Noguchi, who his entire life despised labels and pigeonholing and stereotypes, when it came to choosing his own mentors, chose Brancusi, who of course is a Romanian folk artist who became a celebrated modernist, but in his own mind never stopped being a Romanian folk artist, but based in Paris, and then Cipaișur. And we did an exhibition with the University of Michigan Museum of Art back in 2013 about Noguchi's relationship with Cipaișur. That was a wonderful show, both here in New York and there in Ann Arbor. And there's a wonderful catalog, which I encourage anybody who is interested in this subject to get. It's full of terrific essays. But so Noguchi chose Cipaișur, who some people call the Picasso of China, a wonderful ink wash painter, very prolific ink wash painter at the beginning of the century. And Noguchi went from Paris across Europe and Asia to China. And there, as he always did, met somebody who introduced him. Again, no shared language in common, didn't matter. And Noguchi spent about 6 months sort of working in the mornings on his own and then spending the afternoons in Cipaișur's studio watching him work and learning ink brush technique, and made a whole body of work, which we still have in, which was the basis in part of that exhibition. But the key thing here is to understand Noguchi's definition of East and West. And actually, the person who said it best was Noguchi's great friend, probably best friend, Buckminster Fuller, the futurist and engineer and architect and everything else, wonderful optimist, idea guy, like the ultimate brainstormer, American brainstormer of the 20th century. Anyway, he said that Noguchi's East and West both circle all the way around the globe in either direction, making them perfectly overlapping. And that's a really good way to understand how Noguchi thought about these things. So we're going to progress on. This established a pattern, all of this travel early on, which, by the way, remember, this was when it was really hard to travel. There was no airplane travel in these days. So it was boats and trains mostly, which were very slow. But it began a pattern for Noguchi of consistently traveling to find himself, to find his way, to find new places to work, to find new traditions to connect to. Here, these are both images of his, both on a boat leaving China on the right and of the Great Wall, of course, on the left. In each place that he went, this is in the ceramic studio of a wonderful Japanese ceramist from around 1930. Noguchi, after Beijing or Peking at the time, went to Japan. He had written ahead to his father. That fraught relationship continued. His father told him, don't come to Japan. And if you do come to Japan, don't you dare use my name. Noguchi went anyway. By this time, he was identifying himself as Isamu Noguchi. When he was in LaPorte, Indiana, I didn't mention, but he mostly went by Sam Gilmore. At that point, he was still using his mother's name, and Sam for short for Isamu. But as he started his artistic career in New York City, he realized that using his full name and using Noguchi was useful to him. And so he started using that name. These are works that he made in this ceramic studio in 1930. Unfortunately, these things are mostly lost. They're things that we're searching for, like the duck in the egg is something that we're desperately seeking. But again, the pattern here that's important is this traveling to connect to various traditions. I've already mentioned Bucky Fuller on the left. This is Noguchi's chrome-plated bust of Buckminster Fuller. And on the right, Martha Graham. They formed a kind of troika beginning in 1928 in New York. And the three of them together are responsible for a lot of what we think of as the sort of core of a modern American modernism. Noguchi's social network, we would call it today, was itself a kind of work of art. It was extraordinarily diverse, made up of incredibly creative people in their fields, many of them revolutionaries in their fields. And they really formed the basis that helped Noguchi step outside just the kind of the typical mold of being an artist. He didn't want to be an artist. He wanted to be a great American. He wanted to invent the new in an American sense. And he did that to the extent that he did do that. It was really a product of the diversity of his interests and of these influences upon him. So I want to show a couple of examples of just how these influences worked. This is an amazing drawing that Bucky Fuller made in 1928 that's sometimes referred as Bucky's mandala. And you can see it's got a heart and the sun and a baby and a church, and there's a dirigible and tennis rackets, umbrellas and automobiles and steamer trunks and airplanes and sailboats. And we've got at the center the earth, and it's got examples of nature and technology and traditional architecture. And there's a rubric all the way around the outside that says lightful. And then written around the edges, we've got time, exquisite light, time, slow matter, time, fellowship, production, time, metal, mechanics. This is really Bucky's vision of a totally perfectly integrated planet Earth, where nature and man are working in harmony and making the world ever better. Bucky made so many wonderful statements, but Bucky's greatest statement maybe was the idea that our job should be to make the world work for 100% of humanity. That was his goal, and that's what he believed technology could achieve. And Noguchi was his maybe first really important acolyte. Bucky would go on to coin the wonderful phrase Spaceship Earth. He wrote an operating manual for Spaceship Earth, which is a great read. And Noguchi may have really been the first conscious citizen of Bucky's spaceship Earth. And you can see it in a drawing like this. With Martha, Martha really became the partner with whom Noguchi completely rethought what it meant to use sculpture to shape space, and to shape space as a way to shape civic experience, which is really his goal. He said around in the early 30s, again, on an exhibition pamphlet, he wrote that sculpture can be a vital force in our everyday lives if pushed into communal usefulness. And that's really what he wanted to do. But in order to do that, he really had to understand how to shape space. And he didn't realize it at the time. In fact, he didn't realize it for really 30 years. But he did that working in the theater with Martha, because the black box is an amazing place, because it's like a holodeck, or it's like Rhino or any other kind of computer modeling program, where you start with a void in which you get to establish all of the rules and the way that the universe works and all of the cultural assumptions and everything else. And Noguchi was extremely good, or got extremely good at doing that with very limited means. So in this case, this is his first set for Martha Graham. It's called Frontier. And it's basically I mean, it has some issues now, and I'm not going to go into sort of deconstructing it as a trope of manifest destiny, but that's what we're basically looking at here, is a dream of the infinite possibilities of the American West. The rope representing kind of not just infinite perspective in an artistic sense, but also railroad going into the West, into the distance, with this pioneer fence in between, and Martha representing the frontier spirit, the American frontier spirit. It's really important to remember, Noguchi was born in 1904. He lived for a long time. He worked in 8 separate decades, and American mores and the way that we think about things changed significantly over that time, and that's reflected in his own work. Now, this is a very early self-portrait that I adore for a couple of reasons. One, this is all carved from one large branch. It's pear wood, and it suffers from all of the issues that happen when you use one enormous piece of wood. It's significantly cracked, but it's a magnificent thing. This shows Noguchi as kind of a 10-year-old boy doing his morning exercises, and you can see in the image on the right that he's made the eyes by slicing a paste costume jewelry bead in half and then nailing it into his own face. But you can see this incredibly live quality, and all importantly, the looking back through the legs, that this is not somebody who looks at things the way most people do. So the nature of his vision, or he called it, he despised, by the way, the idea of style. He was not interested in style ever. He dismissed abstract expressionism as just a bunch of guys perfecting their signatures. He was interested in his perspective, or his point of view, and that was composed of many elements, but one incredibly important aspect of it was this ability to see the macro and the micro simultaneously, and to vibrate back and forth between them, and to cook them into single objects. So on the left hand, we're seeing the cover of Bucky's Shelter magazine, which was an incredibly important magazine in the early 30s. And this is a sculpture that Noguchi made as a kind of portrait of a girlfriend, another choreographer, dancer choreographer, Ruth Page, a Midwesterner, wonderful modernist. And this is her as a kind of spaceship, as you can see. And on the right, this is much later piece, but this is Noguchi's rendering. It's a kind of a sculpture rendering of mitosis, or cell division. So we get everything from the cosmic to the microscopic, and Noguchi exists kind of everywhere in between. You can see that too in these 2 images of him, one from the 30s, one from the 80s. Here, Noguchi is somebody who's kind of looking at the totality of things, and sort of always focusing on unusual perspectives that allowed him, again, to think about public space in a different way. Also develop a sense of mission. He had an enormous sense of mission, which he got from Bucky. He had it naturally, but Bucky gave it a kind of a shape. Another aspect of that vision that's really incredibly important, Noguchi saw nature as the greatest technologist. He did not see, really, Noguchi is a great bridger of the kind of the classic dichotomies that we think separate modernism from tradition, for example. Noguchi just didn't accept any of those dichotomies. He believed all of those things could be harmonized and really melded together or were knit together. So a good example of that, this is a lost piece on the left, sadly lost, called 1,000 horsepower Hart. This should resonate well in Detroit. This is a 2-stroke motor, which is appended to a human heart. It's a kind of a cyborg power plant, and absolutely amazing thing, modeled in plaster, again lost. And on the right is a panel that still exists. This is in New York City, Rockefeller Plaza. It was made for the Associated Press News building, and it's called News. And at the time, and still, it was the biggest cast stainless steel panel in the world. It weighs more than 9,000 pounds, and it's celebrating the 4 freedoms, the freedom of the press. Noguchi, in terms of technology, is totally fascinating. Noguchi loved traditional craft, in particular, craft traditions, because there's so much wisdom baked into them. And something that's lasted 1,000 years, there's a very good reason for that, because typically it works. So what we're looking at here is an ad for the rocking stool that he made for the Knoll Corporation. And it is based, as you can see in the photo top right, it's based on a market stool from Congo. This one was from Congo, but it's from the Lobi people in Western Africa. And it's a round bottom stool. It's sometimes called the fidget stool or a market stool, because it's one that you can sit on and wiggle while you're sit. So if you're sitting, say, in a market all day, a market stall, but you want to keep moving, or you just happen to be a fidgety person, this stool is designed to make that easy. And Noguchi made a very sort of technologically up-to-date version of it on the left. This is an extraordinary stool because the top doesn't rest on the bottom. This works like a bicycle wheel. So the top and the bottom are actually strung and held together by tension. So it's actually tension that's keeping supporting your weight when you're sitting on the top, not that its force is not being transferred to the base through stiff legs or through a stiff post, as in a typical stool or chair. Noguchi called this, or what he did with Akari, or in the case of the rocking stool, he called it the true development of an old tradition, which is a beautiful way to understand. Noguchi was always whip stitching the past into the future. And we'll hear from him later on what he thought about the nature of the past and of time in general. But what he adored so much about Akari, the development of Akari, is that he went to Gifu City, Japan, and he found this extraordinary technology, wound bamboo ribbing, and mulberry bark paper, which is extremely resilient and highly collapsible, as you can see. And as he said, all this technology, 300-year-old technology already existed. He just had to deflect it into the future, which again, Noguchi's a wonderful writer. For anybody who's interested, there is an anthology of his writing called Essays and Conversations from 1994 that you can find used, and I highly recommend. But anyway, so deflecting the traditional paper lantern, which at the time was candle powered. So Noguchi made step 1 was to electrify it. And then step 2 was to break away from the bamboo collars, the stiff frames, the traditional shapes, and to basically set light free and to make these incredible glowing lanterns, which are really representatives of nature in the home. And I sometimes say Akari is really the most ubiquitous sculpture on earth, barring a few religious icons. There are tens of thousands of them out there in homes, improving daily life all over the planet. The pattern of travel continued. I won't get into World War II, very complicated. Noguchi interned himself in one of the Japanese internment camps, prison camps run by the United States government. He wasn't subject to the orders of the War Relocation Authority because he was living in New York, but he chose to go in any way to redesign the camps. But from beginning to end, World War II was devastating for him, very disillusioning. The attack on Pearl Harbor and then the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki really rocked his faith, his sort of bedrock American optimism. And he decided to go on the road. He decided he didn't want to make art anymore. He was not interested in art for art's sake. He began talking about looking beyond what he called the false horizon of the museum pedestal, which is a phrase that we carry with us at the museum and try to put into action in everything that we do with Noguchi's legacy out in the world. But he decided to go on the road. And he said that what he wanted to do was to rediscover sculptures, the role that sculpture used to play in daily life. And really he meant in religion and society more broadly, and wanted to figure out how that worked, and then wanted to try to put it into action. So he began traveling around the world. It was on a Paul Mellon Fund grant called the Bullingham Foundation. He told them he was going to write a book. He got a grant, an initial grant for 12 months. And then he began to renew it and ended up traveling for almost a decade. Here he is at Versailles, Angkor Wat. He traveled all over Europe, Southeast Asia, extensively in Southeast Asia. Here he is at Shiseido Temple with one of his many friends and mentors and guides and compatriots, Saburo Hasegawa. We did a wonderful exhibition that was on their relationship as well. There's a catalog for that published by UC Press that I recommend. Noguchi is here at center, Hasegawa on the left. Hasegawa is one of those many figures. Noguchi gravitated to people in Japan who were, or experts in Japan, who were the kind of masters who became rebels. Hasegawa is one of those. Sofu Teshigahara is a good example, Mirei Shigemori. The list goes on and on and on. Kenzo Tange. I think there's another slide here that just maybe taking forever to load. No, okay, I'm gonna keep going. Karnak, Noguchi sought out standing stones all over the world, stone installations all over the world. Noguchi was very interested in the kind of basic modes that you find on every continent that humanity has settled, and was always looking for those commonalities. And obviously the use of stone is one, and a very early one, and one that we know quite a lot about in its continuity, because stone lasts often quite a long time. The thing about sculpture that's wonderful is sculpture has a working history of 10,000 years. Painting has a working history of 500 years. So I often joke, sculpture is about civilization, painting is about culture, and Noguchi was definitely interested in civilization. Here he is in the heart of one of the instruments in a Jantar Mantar in, this one is in Delhi, St. Mark's in Venice. Now, Noguchi, like everybody, went to Venice. Actually, he went, in this case, with Shirley. His then fairly new wife was a Japanese movie star. He did not propose to her, by the way. He was told that he would be marrying her. She was interested in starting a Hollywood career. She was the most famous movie star in Japan. She is an amazing character who there's a lot of scholarly interest in her. Like Noguchi, she went by many different names and worked in many different guises. She had 7 working names in her lifetime. She was sometimes known as the Japanese Mata Hari because she was born in China and was viewed as a double agent both in Japan and in China, but then went on to become a well-known Japanese politician and political commentator later in life. She was sort of the Cokie Roberts of Japan, but she was married to Noguchi for a fairly brief period in the 50s. And they went to Venice together on their honeymoon, traveling around the world. But of course, for him, it was a working vacation. Yes, they went to St. Mark's, but when Noguchi was most interested in Venice, and we have a couple dozen photographs of this site, was a derelict miniature golf course. And you can see that Noguchi was interested in miniature golf for the same reason that he was interested in working in the theater, because it's a place where there really are no rules, and you get to create an entire universe where you get to make the rules, and you get to create the entire built environment. And that was incredibly exciting to him. So in gathering all of these influences and all these resources from around the world, the purpose of doing that was to be able to make spaces like this. So Noguchi, as always, was offered an opportunity for the new UNESCO headquarters in Paris to create a single work of art, which was supposed to be placed on the terrace, proposed terrace that you can see at the top of the image on the right, or the center of the image on the left. And as he always did, he went about taking over as much of the project as he could. At the time, this sunken area where the garden is now was supposed to be a big open area, and the thought was to put a Calder stabile in the middle of it. And Noguchi made a proposal to take over this entire area, and the Calder ended up getting moved to a little plot on the other side of the building, which was part of an ongoing sort of friendly, semi-friendly rivalry with Calder. But in any case, he made this amazing space, which he called a somewhat or semi-Japanese garden. Very important. There's nothing pure in Noguchi ever. Everything is always hybridized. In fact, in an essay for Reader's Digest that he was asked to write, commissioned to write by the Wallaces on the way into Poston, the camp that he went to, the prison camp that he went to, he wrote in a personal essay, the first line of it is, "To be hybrid anticipates the future," which I always think of is, that should be on the back of our currency. It's every bit as good and much more comprehensible than E pluribus unum as a kind of American mission statement. But anyway, this amazing garden, which combines, it is drawing on Japanese garden traditions, but to do something quite different. As he put it, what he wanted to do was find a way to take all of that technology of the Japanese garden, and that's how he viewed sites like Ryoenji or Shisendo, where we saw him, as a form of technology. And he wanted to adapt its strategies and techniques and figure out how to bake them into sculpture that wasn't bounded by those traditions, rooted in those traditions, but not bounded by those traditions. And that's what he did here at UNESCO. A good example, just a very practical example of how that worked, there's a technique in Japanese garden making called hide and reveal, which you all probably are very familiar with, but it's basically the notion that it was developed for small gardens, pocket gardens, interstitial gardens, where the goal was to take a teeny tiny space and make it feel vast, infinite even. And the way to do that is not to show everything all at once, because if you can't see everything all at once, that leaves the door open to your mind to fill in the blanks. And our minds are very good at creating a kind of infinite field painting out of whatever reality we're presented with. Noguchi was interested in seeing if he could take something like the idea of hide and reveal and not use it to make a space, but to make it an object that functioned like a space. So this is called the illusion of the fifth stone. And you can see just in these two photos, on the left, it looks like it's 4 stones. On the right, it looks like it's 5 stones. Sometimes from some points of view, it looks like only 3 stones. And your mind is left to wonder, how is this thing composed? It is like a puzzle for your brain, and you never solve it, which is great. Because the second you solve a work of art, it's pretty much dead to you. You lose interest in it. You get bored pretty quickly of things that you think you understand. But Noguchi was very good at making these objects that resist that, because they are the perfect combination of being indexical and representational and abstract all at the same time. So we're going to listen to Noguchi now, because he's a lot better to listen to than I am.
I decided to do these metal sculptures. Having come back from doing the UNESCO garden, I wanted to do things in metals, because after all, it's unreasonable to do stones in New York. So we got to work doing metal sculptures and got the metal from the aluminum company and did a whole show, Shoji and I, in very quick order. But that was a long time ago, 58. The galleries would say, well, this is too commercial, you see. And so I had difficulty showing it at the time. Couldn't show it till about 61 or 2, around in there. But now you find metal sculptures everywhere. But that's the way it was then. You can do certain things with a machine, but no more. I mean, for instance, this is a diacro bender. There are other benders. There are all kinds of machines. And if you want to make a curved surface, you can even explode it with some dynamite, you see. There are many things you can do, but even so, it's a limitation. If you want to live and work in an industrialized situation, you have to use industrial materials and tools, you see. However, I was not quite satisfied with that, because I felt the limitations of such tools, forced one to be a part of industry, rather than free. And I felt that the more old-fashioned way of doing things, for instance with stone, with your own hands, left you greater freedom. And so I went back to stone, and I'm still working on stone. I was working on wood for a while. But, one shifts, I do, backwards and forwards. Sometimes I think I'm part of this world today. Sometimes I feel that maybe I belong in history or in prehistory, or that there is no such thing as time. But if you're caught in time, or the immediate present time, then your choice is very limited. You can only do certain things really correctly belonging to that time, you see. But if you want to escape from that time constraint, then the whole world, you see, I mean, not just the most industrialized world, but the whole world is someplace where you belong.
So that beautiful sentiment, if you can escape the constraints of time, then the whole world is somewhere you belong. And thinking back to the UNESCO garden, it would be hard to imagine somebody who would have been more appropriate to give that much space to, because Noguchi spent his entire life and career becoming a kind of one-man United Nations, trying to understand again how to knit the world together by bridging these ridiculous dichotomies like the one between the past and the future, and between tradition and modernity, and all of these things, or technology and sort of more traditional way of doing things. Here you could see two images. This is the same man, just a couple of years apart, talking on his birthday on a very early cell phone. I love this, his sweater's not even pulled down, his shirt's barely tucked in, and on the left in kind of traditional garb. These images are both at Murray. I highly encourage you, if you haven't been to Noguchi's studio in Japan, and you go to Japan and you can get to Shikoku, you can do it on your way to the art islands, to Naoshima, Teshima. It's easy. This is about 15 minutes on a tram or on light rail from Takamatsu. So these dichotomies, we see Noguchi in all these different guises. This is once he's created the museum. On the piece on the left, or the image on the left, he's making a whole body of galvanized steel sculptures, which at the time, a lot of eyeball rolling and eye raising, because galvanized steel is mostly just used for urban furniture, lampposts and guardrails and things. Noguchi decided to make a whole body of work, 26 pieces in large editions. And then on the right, a piece called Indian Dancer that's still in our garden. This is in the garden at the museum. And the whole sculpture, as you can see, is wreathed in ivy. And Noguchi let nature interact as it chose with these pieces in the garden. We don't do that to quite this extent today, because our trustees obviously now have a fiduciary duty to keep these things in a good working order as long as possible. And we struggle all the time with what that means. But it's great to remember what Noguchi wanted, at least while it was his garden. Now, I want to talk about play, because in thinking about how Noguchi created or wanted to create, again, sort of civic space or a civic sculpture, he focused increasingly on young people, although young people of all ages. This is the piece that he put at the center of the American Pavilion when he represented the United States at the Biennale in 1986. And here he is using the slide. He's 82 years old here. This is a 10-foot tall marble slide. And at the time, they had to actually pay some Europeans to slide down it at first in order to get press photos, because the taboo against touching art was so strong. And that's what Noguchi, of course, was interested in busting. There's a really nice story about this piece. A lot of Noguchi's friends came to the Biennale, of course, including people like Issei Miyake, who was a close friend of Noguchi's. And Miyake told this story later. He actually wrote it, and we have it as an essay in a book about Noguchi, reminiscences about Noguchi. And so they're standing there together and they're watching people slide down it. And Miyake turned to Noguchi and said, "This must be strange for you to see people crawling all over a piece of your sculpture. What do you think about that?" And Noguchi said that I think those kids are going to learn a lot about sculpture with their butts. And that's a good way to understand what Noguchi valued in the way that he thought. He was all about empirical experience and empirical intelligence. So this idea of play was incredibly central to Noguchi's career from beginning to end. The first important, some people argue Noguchi is really the godfather of land art. The first important piece he proposed back in 1933 for New York City was called Play Mountain. He continued to propose playgrounds all over the place. Didn't get to build one until 1965 in Japan. His last attempt in New York City, which was a full collaboration with Louis Kahn that lasted more than 5 years, over 5 completely separate plans, and finally failed, just never materialized. This is Noguchi's proposal for the American Pavilion for the Osaka World's Fair, or the Osaka Expo in 1970. And this was a lunar garden. So it was a proposal that the first thing that we should build on the moon was a playground. And this was a proposal for that playground. It was not accepted. He went on to make many spaces, some of which we'll look at, but none more important than the Noguchi Museum itself. At the time when it opened, it was the Isamu Noguchi Garden Museum. That's the name that he gave it. It is a magnificent space that is semi and somewhat in every conceivable way. If you haven't been, please do come see us and visit. It is meant to be a kind of a lasting encapsulation of his point of view and his perspective, which he hoped would be a kind of a rock in the river of history. It's a magnificent achievement. We leave the first floor pretty much the way that he left it, as a kind of total work of art installation. This is what the garden looked like when fairly early on. This is a few years in to planting, but almost all of these trees when he planted them were 1/4-inch saplings. This was all done with his own money. The Katsura tree at the very center of our image, right behind Noguchi, when it was planted, was only about 4.5 feet tall. And this is what it looks like today. It is sometimes when people ask me now what my favorite Noguchi is, and of course I can't answer that, but I sometimes say the Katsura tree at the center of our garden, which he imagined or must have imagined or would have had to have imagined what kind of space this garden would become. Because again, as you see here, it looked a bit like a prison yard when it was finished with all this exposed concrete block and security fencing and hardscape. But this is what it has become. It's really a magnificent achievement. And it gives you a sense of what he was interested in. So here we are at Morinuma Park, which is the last big project that he was working on when he died. This was for a 454-acre landfill outside the city of Sapporo. This was a city dump that was being reclaimed, and Noguchi was hired ultimately to plan much of it and create a kind of a park. And he ended up planning something that I jokingly call Noguchi Disneyland, which kind of was a kind of a hybrid collection of many of the works of land art that weren't executed in his lifetime, including a version of Play Mountain at the left. It included a piece called Sea Fountain, which is about almost 200 feet across. And over the course of a 45-minute computer program that Noguchi designed, it replays the biblical flood. So here we see the basin filling. Here it's full. We have a kind of a tempestuous ocean, and then it drains out. And then the fountains come back on and a rainbow comes out. So if there's any sun at all, because of the misting of the fountain, you get a rainbow that travels in 365 degrees as you walk around the circle. Really an unbelievable piece of art, experiential art. This is Play Mountain model, just so you get a sense of it. And here it is in detail. The reason why I gave it so much time is we're going to watch another short clip here, because this is what a Noguchi feels like when it's working. So this is our curator of research, Matt Kirsch, on the left, and the artist Jan Vo on the right, who came out to meet us to look at Noguchi playground equipment. And they are essentially, as you can see, ascending to heaven. This is walking up the backside of Play Mountain. This is the kind of sculpture that Noguchi envisioned and that he wanted to produce. One where really mankind is working in harmony with the planet. The thing I like about Noguchi so much, or I think is so motivating today about Noguchi as an ecologist meaning just kind of big systems, complete systems thinker, is that he didn't hate mankind. He didn't think that the solution to the world's problems was to eliminate mankind, as some ecologists do. That's kind of the nth degree of ecological thinking or green thinking. Noguchi really just thought that we should be designing better. He wanted Spaceship Earth to be one great functioning sculpture. And why am I representing that with Black Sun in Seattle? There's just something wonderful about this child discovering this work as if he's experiencing the universe for the first time. Noguchi sometimes said that he wanted kids coming to one of his playgrounds or anybody entering one of his environments to feel like the first person on Earth. That's a pretty good, again, aspiration for sculpture. Now I'm going to do just a quick thing on public space and get to Hart Plaza, because here we are in Detroit. How can we not talk about Hart Plaza? Noguchi put a lot of effort into altering public spaces. Here we have an octetra modular play system placed in front of Spoleto Cathedral. I apologize for the quality of the slide, but this is an entire plaza that Noguchi designed in a complex created by Kenzo Tange for the city or commune of Bologna in Italy. This is a magnificent courtyard that Noguchi made in an empty space at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, a Louis Kahn building. And Noguchi made this piece to put in this empty space in honor of Louis Kahn. It's called Constellation. This is a great piece called Sky Viewing Sculpture that Noguchi made for Red Square at Western Washington University. The university is a great model because it's a civic model in miniature. And this is one that was particularly nice because they have the equivalent of a kind of Italian city square at the heart of the campus, as so many do in various quadrangles. And Noguchi tried to make something appropriate for the kind of university that Western Washington is. This is California Scenario, a wonderful space that still exists in Southern California in an office park. It's maybe Noguchi's most complete spatialized concept, space concept. That brings us to Hart Plaza. Hart Plaza is another one of those examples. There was a competition to design a fountain for the city of Detroit, which meant a conventional water in the middle, horses, or some other kind of figure of sculpture in it sort of fountain. And Noguchi, as he always did, was given an inch and tried to take the entire universe, did eventually manage to take over the entire plaza and design the entire plaza that you all are so familiar with. And it has become the site of many different kinds of events. It's made up of lots of interlocking spaces that maybe people are not so familiar with, but it really is a complete universe which combines many of Noguchi's sort of pyramid and spiraling and terracing concepts, all very basic space shaping ideas that you find all over the world that the Noguchi adapted here in various guises. But the whole purpose was to create space at the heart of the city that could actually become the heart of the city and would accommodate lots of different kinds of activities. But you know, it is extraordinarily difficult, as we know, because we visit places all over, to create something that actually feels like being in the center of everything. And that's what you want from your civic spaces. You want a space that accommodates your, I think this is the 2004 Pistons World Championship celebration. I think this one is the Red Wings. That's a pretty stunning picture. You can see people in the fountain, center left. Lots of different kinds of activities, accommodates lots of different kinds of activities. Of course, this space is by no means perfect, but I think it has accomplished or did accomplish its principal goal, which is to be a place that you associate with your love of where you live. And that creates, again, that sort of civic sense that when you're standing there, as you do in, say, the Plaza Mayor in Madrid or in the Plaza at Teotihuacan, crossing in front of the Temple of the Sun, that you somehow feel like this spot that you're standing on is the center of the world. That's an incredibly exciting feeling, and it's extraordinarily hard to create. I think that's where I'm going to end with, again, Isamu Noguchi, transnational icon. By the way, all good transnationalism is rooted in the local. And that's what Noguchi was so good at is, and as Noguchi traveled all over the world, and Noguchi was a master appropriator, almost everything that Noguchi did was appropriation of one kind or another, but he sort of forged a model for how to do it well, how to do it properly. And it's about the level of seriousness and respectfulness and how to, and sort of forward-looking and forward-thinking. The people who were the masters of the forms that Noguchi messed with respected Noguchi, because the people who love those traditional craft forms, especially the most, want to see them survive into the future, and they want them to thrive in the future. They don't want them pickled in amber. And that's something that Noguchi was really cognizant of. And as we think about his legacy for the future, and we are very interested in what happens to Dodge Fountain and Hart Plaza, and are excited to play a role in that as the city starts to rethink that plaza for the future. And with that, I'm going to end. I don't know if we're going to have a question and answer period, but I'm very happy to answer questions. I know, Lizanne, what is the plan from here?
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Really fun to see pictures of Hart Plaza, and what a fantastic presentation. I wanted to say I could go on listening to that for hours, but I do have a question, and it was more about what you referenced at the very end about when these public places are rethought of and have to get let's say renovated or rejuvenated. Like, is that going on in some other places, some other projects of Noguchi's as well, like it is going on at Hart Plaza in Detroit?
Absolutely. It is an issue all over the world, and not just for Noguchi. We know there are many famous stories of site-specific artworks being removed for various reasons.
Yes.
Ironically, the things that were commissioned for the most important buildings are the ones that are often the most at risk, because say in Manhattan, downtown Manhattan, that real estate is so valuable that it rotates fast, because those buildings, to get like a commercial office building, to keep getting the rents that they need to get in order to pay off the mortgages that they get to buy those buildings, they need them to be top earning buildings. And the way to do that is to renovate them frequently and keep them up to date. So those pieces are always at risk. And we play a role, sometimes very direct, sometimes indirect, but the key is to try to figure out how to give those pieces another life if they get displaced, whether they can have another life. This is incredibly controversial. We stand with preservation for sure, but preservation isn't always realistic. And we take a slightly more pragmatic view. I think it's case by case, and it's about, rolling up your sleeves and digging in and trying to make sure that the pieces, if they're going to survive, don't get broken. Like I said, it is very hard to make a truly civic feeling space, and it's very easy to break them. And you can add trees and lawn, and you can food carts and all sorts of things. And that should all be tried, and it should all be done. And it's important to make things work for the people who use them. But you also want to try to preserve the genius of what's there.
Absolutely. Okay, that's interesting. Well, since Hart Plaza really is at the center of our city, it's very well known. It's outside my office window at 1 Woodward inside the Yamasaki building, but it's also outside the window of the Japanese consulate at the Renaissance Center. So it's a nice Japanese connection for us. And I think that we Detroiters and visitors too share a memory of Hart Plaza, where we've all attended ethnic festivals and those sports celebrations and the jazz festival. So it's a place where we kind of share a memory of place. Our memories are founded in the same places.
New York doesn't really have one of those places. I mean, I would rather be drowned in the East River than go to Times Square. And a lot of New Yorkers feel that way. But even if you do go to New York, Times Square and participate in one of those things, it doesn't have that same sense of being the heart of the city. And it's not a space that you really want to be in there. You go there despite the space, not because of the space. So there are a lot of very important cities in the world that don't have a central square, a public square, the way that Detroit does.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Well, we're fortunate, but I think, over time, the stature of its creator has been under-recognized. So this has been a very important presentation for us and for the city to better understand our own riches and to recognize, of course, contributions from Japanese American artists and architects. And so that's what we're always working on. And if someone wants to ask a question, if they could put it in the chat, we could answer one or two, but we're running out of time.
I think they're in the Q&A.
Okay. Do you see them?
I do. I see a couple. I'm happy to answer.
Okay, go ahead.
One combined one.
Please.
So yes, there is some. It's complex, the situation at the studio in Murray, but we're working with that foundation in Japan, which we helped to establish, and they're kind of our sister institution to make sure that the studio and museum and garden there are preserved. I was kind of referring when I was talking about commercial office space before in Manhattan to 666 Fifth Avenue, where a massive Noguchi ceiling and waterfall were removed. We participated in that in the end because it was better to do that than to have those pieces end up in a landfill. So we are trying to figure out right now what to do with them exactly, but we're going to show them both in London with our gallery, White Cube Gallery, almost in their entirety. So this almost 8,000 square foot ceiling and 40-foot long, 20-foot tall working waterfall wall. And we are looking for a way to, as I said, give those a new life, a second life that's worthy of their creation, because we ultimately believe if we can find the right place, the right partners, that's better than putting them in storage forever. Yeah. Because that's the alternative.
Awful.
Well, Noguchi was massively inspired. The question was Noguchi inspired by Diego Rivera's mural at the DIA? Who isn't, or who hasn't been? Incredibly impressive thing. But Noguchi knew Rivera well. Noguchi was invited to Mexico City in 1935 as one of a group of American artists who went down to create murals and other public artworks in a market called the Abelardo Rodriguez Market. And Noguchi made an enormous anti-fascist mural there in deep relief and spent a year and a half and spent some of that time staying with Rivera and Kahlo. He had an affair with Frida Kahlo, but stayed friends with them. So yes, he was massively influenced. And there was an excellent exhibition, by the way, called Vida Americana, organized just last year by the Whitney Art Museum, which I think is still traveling, which is about the impact that the Mexican muralists had on civic artists or civically active artists in the United States. I guess there's just one other question about why Detroit selected Noguchi. Well, Noguchi was just one participant in this competition. He had a couple of people in the city championing his way of thinking about what could be done at Hart Plaza, which is to say more than just smacking a fountain, a kind of traditional fountain in the middle. And the mayor and a number of others got behind the program. And in the end, the city of Detroit invested an enormous amount in Hart Plaza and Dodge Fountain with private support. Of course, it was a public-private partnership. But it was really for Noguchi. Noguchi created an entire business to do it, which became one of his most important tools going forward, called Noguchi Fountain and Plaza, which was the kind of the business by which he pursued these public projects, working, I should say, in very close collaboration with another brilliant Japanese American, Shoji Sadao, who was both Buckminster Fuller's right hand and Noguchi's right hand, an unsung hero of American design in the 20th century, because you can't imagine working for two more difficult people than Buckminster Fuller and Isamu Noguchi, and Shoji, who died a couple of years ago, but was on our board and was the president of the foundation for many years. No one could have done it better. There's a digital feature, by the way, about Shoji on our website, along with many other digital features. I didn't really say anything about the museum, but we are the home base for Noguchi worldwide, the archives, catalog raisonné, and now a lot of digital content for those who are interested, including we've posted our entire archives online, more than 60,000 records, 500,000 pages of photographs and documents. So you really have access to everything that I have access to in terms of Noguchi on site. Thank you so much. I realized I could drone on forever.
Okay, no, thank you so much. Thank you. And we just want to confirm that the fact that your name is Dakin Hart and it's Hart Plaza.
Yeah, no relationship.
Yeah.
No, just a coincidence.
That's a nice one, though. Well, thank you again, Dakin. I really appreciate, we all really appreciate, and all the applause.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again. And I want to thank the Freer House and the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research and the National Association of Japan America Societies and the Japan-US Friendship Commission, and to all of you for joining us tonight. What a wonderful talk. I'm glad we put Noguchi back at the center of our city. Good night. Thank you, Dakin. Good night.